In this video, I'd like to show you how to get started with the web hierarchical grid. And so let me show you a demo of what we've got. Here's the grid here bound up to the Northwind database. We're looking at the suppliers table. Now, based on each one of these suppliers, we can click on the expansion node here and see each one of the products that these suppliers offer. To get things set up this way, there's actually no code behind necessary. So let me show you how it's done. Here we are in Visual Studio 2008, and I just have a standard web forms page here, and we've got our form tag and the script manager already on the page. So the first thing that we need to do is add on a web hierarchical grid control. So we'll come over to the toolbox, and I loaded in the controls from the web client August CTP by basically just creating a new tab and then browsing for the items. And so we'll drag on the web hierarchical grid. We'll start off by giving it an ID, and let's call this grid. And we're going to keep things really simple right now. So what I want to do is start off by doing auto-generate bands and auto-generate columns. So the bands will be the child items underneath, and the columns are the main columns of the grid. So we can kind of leave it at that for now. So the next thing that we want to add onto the page is the web hierarchical data source. Let's go on and find that here. And what this control does is manages the data that comes into the grid and also maps the relationships between the data so that everything can line up correctly to be displayed up on the grid. So we'll give this an ID of DS for data source. And we'll come back here in just a minute after we've set up some of the other data source controls to provide the data to the hierarchical data source. So we'll just go ahead and use the SQL data source for right now. So we'll come back over to the toolbox, grab our SQL data source, and I want to call this one suppliers. And we'll just copy this, and we'll call the next one products. So now let's switch over to design view, and we can customize the data source controls. Now I've got an error here with my hierarchical data source about the licensing information. It's because this is a CTP, and hey, this is the developer box, and you never know what's on here. So let's come up to this data source, and we'll customize this. Now I'm going to go ahead and choose the Northwind connection string, because this app has already been connected to Northwind before. And from here, we'll go directly to the suppliers table. And I'd like to select the supplier ID, company name, contact name, region, and that should be it. So we'll finish that up. And then we're going to be making a data relation over to the products. So come back to Northwind connection string. Let's go to the products table. And we want to take a look at the product ID, product name, supplier ID, and quantities per unit. Now that we've got our data sources put together, we want to come back up to the hierarchical data source and start to fill this out a little bit. We'll start off by creating some data views. So the first data view here, we'll just call this DV suppliers. The data member will be suppliers. And the data source ID will be the same ID that we have down here in our SQL data source. So we'll create another data view, and this one will be for the products. So the ID that we'll give it is DV products. The data member here is the products table, and the data source ID again is products. So now that we have some data views, we can create some data relations. So let's create a relation here. Now with the parent columns and the child columns, what we're doing is passing in column names that map to one another to build the relationship. This is basically doing the join for us. So for the parent columns, we want to say supplier ID, and child columns is supplier ID. Further, what we want to do is provide the parent data view ID, and this will be DV suppliers, because we initially wanted to show the suppliers in the grid, and then the child data view ID will be the DV products. So to make this grid happen, we have the grid itself, the hierarchical data source that basically formats everything the way we want it to be, as well as two SQL data sources that pull the initial data out of the database for us. Let's go ahead and run it and see how it looks. All right, well, believe it or not, I did do this on purpose because I wanted you to see this error. One of the things you'll find is that if you do all this work and you forget to set the data source ID in the grid, you'll get an error that looks like this. This error isn't very telling about what's wrong, so I wanted you to see it. So let's close this up, and then we'll go back, and for the grid, you can see that the data source ID needs to be set to source, or DS. And we'll just say no. And so here's our grid. It's showing the suppliers first, and when we expand each one, we can see the products that are being associated with each one of the suppliers.
Infragistics. On the web at infragistics.com.